Hi, thank you for joining me this week as we paint this portrait in Impasto. If you're new here, my name is Zoran and I've painted professionally for most of my adult life for more than 25 years now. What we're going to be exploring this week with this Impasto painting tutorial with oils is of course color and the way that I see and approach color, mediums that I gravitate towards, a substrate which we'll get to later on, and maybe some non-conventional paint applications. We're going to, of course, be exploring use of palette knives, sprayers, of course, brushes to some extent, and my favorite tool, which I guarantee you probably haven't used or maybe even heard of, that I'll introduce partway through the video. I tend to arrange my colors on my palette based on how cool or warm they are. As you can see here, along the top I have the cool colors. On the right is Radiant Green, Cobalt Blue, Alizarin Crimson, Ivory Black, and Raw Umber. Along the left axis we have Titanium White, Green, Cadmium Red, Yellow Ochre, and Cadmium Yellow Middle. The green color I believe is Permanent Green Light. Different manufacturers give it different names. I don't normally work in this vertical format. I actually find it quite interesting. I've chosen to do that strictly because of videoing and for you to be able to see exactly how I mixed all these colors as we approach this painting. The focus of this video, as already indicated, obviously will be on the Impasto paint applications, which we will get to later on, relatively soon, however. But in this initial stage, I'm mixing overall cool backgrounds that will complement the warmer tones of the skin of the model that will apply Impasto thickly later on. This paint layer now in the background that I'm applying with the brayer, I wanted to keep quite both loose and thin. A brayer is a favorite tool of mine. I use it quite often, virtually every painting for the underpainting sort of stage, whether for this, a portrait or landscape or some of the cityscapes, of course. It adds sort of visual interest, and the strokes are not formulaic. They just sort of surprise me every time. Here I'm starting to establish some of the darker tones. I do like to do this as somewhat of an anchor. It gives me an idea as to where all the other subsequent layers need to be with regards to value. Sometimes I'll start with the high tones. In this case, I'm doing a darker background, which will be relatively dark and will remain that way even in the final stage, as we'll see. And again, I'm using that brayer to apply that dark. My hand is quite loose as well. I didn't mention that already. It's holding that brayer loosely. I'm applying the paint loosely, even though I'm pressing it. I will tone down, remove some of these hard edges that brayer has a tendency to leave later on. But again, I'm keeping the background colors cool. I want it to sort of remain that way. I will warm it up slightly, as you can see there, with the addition of yellow ochre. But for the most part, it's cool background, warmer foreground. You'll notice as we go along in this video, the prevailing theme that I sort of follow and adhere to for virtually every one of my paintings is this concept of warm and cool color. As we paint the face, I'll get the more details as to what that entails. But just remember, as for the way that I've applied or put paint on my palette, I'm constantly cognizant of the cools and warms and how they juxtaposed or play against one another on the surface. I'm now using this brayer, as you can see, to sort of indicate some sort of features of the face as to where I want it to be relative to the whole space. Um, the design of the surface is also very important. Where do you want the face? How big do you want it? Where's the negative space going to be? I've just added some bit more warmth. Raw umber is being added to that, ivory and cobalt blue, just to warm it up slightly. And as I said earlier, I'm knocking back those edges. I don't want them to be too prominent. They need to be as muted as possible at this stage. The paint is relatively light as well. It is thin, so that once we get to the impasto application, which this video is about, they will become much thicker. Here I'm using a palette knife to block in the final stages of the background, where her hair is going to be and part of her clothing. Now that we're happy with the darks having been blocked in, I start mixing these, what I call pools of color, that I will sort of reference and guide me throughout the painting process of the face and the skin. Here I'm mixing the neutrals with some of the colors along the top to establish, as I said, pools of cool and warm. Raw umber and white gives me just a general overall neutral. And of course, as I said, Viridian and raw umber and white will give you sort of like a neutral cool that you can reference off of. Here at the bottom, as you can see, I'm mixing cadmium, red light, raw umber, and a bit of yellow ochre. As again, just a pool that I can also draw from as I build up color. This is a tool I was referencing earlier that I use all of the time. It helps with keeping the colors as clean as possible and avoiding mud in your painting, which is probably one of the main reasons people have issues when it comes to this type of paintings, where you're applying color on top of color sometimes, and you just invariably get mud. This tool that I'm talking about is like a two-sided squeegee. This is a 1/8 inch, 1/2 inch tool. I do have a larger guy, which is a 1/2 inch and 1 inch. It has two sides to it. It's sort of slanted, and it allows you to sort of apply color and clean instantly with a rag, which you don't see in this video. On my left hand, I've got a rag that I'm constantly cleaning. A lot of people use brushes for these sorts of types of paintings, for impasto in general, but you really have to clean them and clean them often. If you work with oils, you know that they have a tendency to gum up. Paint accumulates in the ferrules of the brush. Is that how you say it? It's ferrule or ferrule, where the hairs meet the sort of the handle. And unless you're working really on light values exclusively that are quite close in color value to one another, which I don't do. I sort of have a tendency to jump around from lights to darks. But as I said, if you've got that rag handy, you clean this guy and he's as good as ready to go. Not to mention, when you're done painting for the day, that's all you have to do, just clean him and off you go. I absolutely disdain washing brushes at the end of sessions, which, it's just one of those things you have to deal with. So again, with regards to one of the keys to this types of painting, impasto in particular, keeping colors separate from one another, keeping them clean, having sort of keys of color or notes of color, as I have a tendency to call them, is of utmost importance. Here, as I said, I'm using this sort of spatula or a mini palette knife made of silicone, and allows me to get the exact effect that I'm after. Later on, I'll do a zoom in. You'll see exactly what these notes of color look like up close, but they are essentially just that, just little small dabs of different color value, sort of like a mosaic painting that the eye reads from a distance as one cohesive sort of plane, but when you come close to the painting, there's all sorts of little small ridges of color that are quite interesting, at least to me. Now, having said that, I do use brushes for impasto work as well. This video is mostly focused on this squeegee tool that, as I said, I use often, but you can get similar effects and you really can't beat brush marks. Brush marks are also quite universally beautiful, I think, and in how interesting of a surface they leave with regards to edges. I plan on doing more videos like this, even another impasto video where I sort of combine this squeegee tool with brush marks. I have used brushes here already in this first part of this video, but the final painting doesn't showcase really the beauty of brush marks and edges that they create, whether they're hard edges, vanishing, soft, and so on and so forth. So keeping in mind that light coming in is cool, as I've already indicated, I am keeping these colors in her eye socket warm in the shadow family. I am mixing some dark tones that are warmer, keeping, for example, raw umber as the base, adding cadmium red light or some greens as well, but keeping them relatively warm. Here I've already started establishing some lights along her forehead and some halftones on the sides of her cheeks. And here you can see what I was referencing to earlier. I do have a tendency to work all over the surface, just establishing sort of keys of interest and color. Here I'm mixing some Viridian to indicate that reflected light on the side of her face. It's very important to remember that to paint impasto, you've got to have paint on the palette in front of you. Quite often I see students that I've worked with in the past, they put small pea amounts of paint beside them, whether for this type of work or any. It's indicative of, I don't know what you want to call it, a frugal way of painting. I know everything's expensive, including paint, but if you don't have enough paint in front of you and you have to sort of reapply paint, it takes you away from the concentration of constantly squinting, comparing, drawing, and applying the correct value where it needs to go. So put as much paint as you'll need for that painting session initially, so you don't have to worry about that. As I indicated already, this vertical format palette is the first time I'm using this, and it's because of YouTube and these videos that I'm hopefully going to continue posting regularly. I find it quite interesting. I don't know, it's something that's new to me, but and I found myself, interestingly enough, constantly trying to looking for color to my right where I usually keep my palette, which, by the way, is significantly larger than this guy here. This, by the way, is a relatively small painting. It's maybe a 16 by 16 study, and it was painted on something called a Mylar. It is a polyester film type of a substrate, very thin. The kind that you need to paint on is matte or frosted, and it's somewhat translucent, if you want to call it. It has two sides. It's really versatile and convenient, and really is close to an oil paint ground type of a slick feel that I've found. I use them quite often, really. I mean, this thing takes anything from ink, charcoal, oil paint, even colored pencil, and pastel, which, by the way, I really like using as well. Hopefully I can make a bunch of videos on soft pastels and oil pastels as we sort of grow here. If you're interested in exploring Mylar as a painting substrate, I've written an article, now that I'm looking at it, on my site from 2019. It feels like it was yesterday. Time really does fly nowadays. But I'll give you some ideas to how you can paint on it, whether you need to prepare it, what to expect, and so on and so forth. I didn't really initially talk about this, but this particular Mylar that I'm painting this portrait on was clear, but on the back side of that is an old oil sketch that was dried and really not to my liking, so I didn't really care for it. So it was painted directly on the actual Mylar without any preparation. In case anyone's wondering, the palette itself is one of these disposable palettes you can get at any art supply stores. I got this guy at a store called the Sayers here in Toronto, Canada, where I live and work. One other thing that I haven't touched upon, but is very important, is mediums. Now, for this particular painting, I haven't used and will not use any. Throughout the painting process, I'm applying paint directly from the tube. As you can see, and I've mentioned, this is a vertical palette and it is very rigid. Paints that I use for this particular painting are Gamblins. They're the exact consistency that I need. One painting Impasto. Now, having said that, I do have Impasto painting mediums. There's a product called Liquid Impasto. I think Gamblin also has an Impasto medium. Various manufacturers offer them, but it's just one of those things that you have to sort of use and play along and see how it works for your style of work. Now, as I said, for this painting, I'm working directly with paints directly from the tube, but that doesn't mean that for the next painting I might not pull out that Impasto medium or another medium which I didn't mention, which is also a very favorite of mine. It's called cold wax medium. I'm sure I'll get to reviewing it and various brands that they're sold under, but it's also very versatile and it adds a little bit more of mystery to oil paints. It's quite unique. Now at this stage, I've covered majority of the model's face with the color values as per referencing the background's darks and the shadows in her eye sockets and some of the halftones on her cheeks. It's imperative to remember, and I'll probably reiterate this a few more times, when dealing with impasto painting, to have color in mind at all times, and also to keep your darks separate from your lights at all times. This is something that we were taught in art school, university, where I studied, and subsequently always I used to sort of teach it to my students. That's one of the keys to keeping colors and paintings fresh, by being cognizant of where the lights are and where the darks are and keeping them separate. Once you establish where the lights and the darks are within your painting, so for our reference here, under her chin, on her neck, majority of her neck, under her eye sockets, her eyes, and the side of the face are either in shadow or halftone shadow. Once we have that established, we can then say, okay, so that's going to remain, I guess, towards the warmer family of dark colors. And the face is being bathed in light, cooler values. One of the easiest ways to get muddy color, by definition muddy color, is to sort of add warm color where cool colors dominate, or vice versa, or adding sort of the wrong temperature color to the wrong part of the painting. As you can see, we've established thus far here majority of the model's light side of her face and the shadow side, keeping in mind that it is a cool light that's falling all over her. If in fact I approach this by adding only cool colors like viridian green, or alizarin crimson, or of course ultramarine blue or cobalt blue, which is a bit warmer, I guess. To her face, she'd be coming across as a little bit maybe diseased in a way. So you want to be cognizant that there's a lot of blood in the side of her face that we're painting, the nose, the cheeks, the forehead, the chin. So even though they're cool, you need to add warmth to them as well. If you're interested in further exploring this cool and warm color palette arrangement and subsequent painting, there's many artists historically and contemporary ones that have used this approach, but the way I was taught is to look at color not simply from a perspective of, oh, red, that's gotta be warm, or blue, that's gotta be cool, but more from a perspective of, is this particular color yellowish or bluish? So for example, you will find that most colors will have their corresponding warm and cool sort of reference colors. So as an example, you can have a blue, which is inherently cool, have it be warm, i.e. cerulean blue, for example, or even phthalo blue, to some extent cobalt, although cobalt is right on the border. And then you'll have a cooler blue, for example, ultramarine blue. And similar can be said for any of the other colors as well. Reds, for example, you've got cadmiums, red light, which I'm using here, which is warmer, of course, or you have cooler or bluish reds, like the alizarin, which I have up on top, magentas as well, and as well yellow. Yellow colors can be cooler or warmer. Yellow ochre is more of a warmer side, or than, for example, cadmium yellow lemon or light, which tend to be cooler. So what I was taught, just to go back to that, is to arrange colors based on warmth along one side and then cool on the other side. Because the nature of this palette, I've already mentioned this, it's a bit smaller, I didn't arrange all of the colors that I normally put out. But the way that I approach this is, as I said, I arrange colors based on temperature, and then I paint the subject exactly the same way. So once you establish where the cool colors are, you can apply both quote unquote cool colors like blues and greens, phthalo greens and blacks and umbers, for example. But you can also apply colors like reds and yellows, or some of the oranges that are classified as more bluish or cooler to that interest, to that particular subject. Here we're coming up to the second day of painting. I've, as you can see, cleaned up the drawing quite a lot. I've sped it along a bit because this video just ended up getting much longer than I was anticipating initially. It was supposed to be a 15-minute video, then 20, and then it ended up being a 30-minute video. So I followed essentially the same principles that I've already discussed of color, values, paint application, and drawing. I didn't really talk much about drawing in this video as I did in the previous ones, but I've paid quite a lot of attention to it here as well, even though the subject is unknown to me. Here I've taken the camera off the tripod, and as promised, I'm moving closer to the textured surface. You can see all of the notes of color that I've applied based on the principles we discussed of color temperature. You can quite clearly see the impasto brush marks that my little squeegee friend leaves behind. There's edges, there's soft edges, there's hard ones. But ultimately, what you have is visual interest, and that's exactly what I'm after for all of my works. As you can see, I'm pointing to two new colors on the palette. They're golden colors, golden oil colors from Winsor & Newton. One is called the Renaissance Gold, one is just gold, more on a bronze side of things. And even though I'm quite happy with the sculpting and the rendering, if you want to call it, of the face and the information and the interest that we were able to sort of achieve, I decided to add this gold to the background to add a bit more of visual interest to it, to balance her face. And as you can see, the background is tack dry. It's not fully dry. The gold is sort of gliding on. It's adhering to the substrate below, and it's not pulling, it's not blending with the underlying blues and blacks. As you can see there, I'm applying the bronze towards the bottom there. I will be blending some of those goldens into the underlying layers later on. And I'm using a palette knife for this application simply because it's the right tool for me for this particular finish. And I think that's also the last thing that I want to convey with regards to this video and this message is the tools that you use, whether it's a squeegee or a brush, which I hope to, as I said, cover later on in some other videos, or in this case, a palette knife brayer. You just use what you need to create, as I said, visual interest to make it appealing to you, firstly, but also to the viewer. I'm often asked about how to create spontaneity, that loose feel and look to a painting. And really, there's no secret. It's just some of the things that we talked about, but also just going out there and experimenting. And a lot of times, most times, it doesn't work out. And sometimes you're surprised with the results. I myself was quite happy with the way this particular portrait came out and just how the colors played off of one another, and that final touch of gold really added this level of elegance to the finish. It's funny, when I showed the drawings to my kids, and my daughter especially, she was critical, saying, "Why is her hair all out of place and disheveled?" And that's just some visual cues that I felt were not necessary to be rendered or indicated. And I left them as is in this particular shape. Maybe if you were looking at the exact same reference or model, you would have rendered that hair a little more, or maybe even less, who knows. I just thought just an indication of her having some sort of hair there is sufficient. And if I had gone any further rendering it or refining it, it probably would have detracted from the message really that I wanted to convey. With these final touches here, I'm just knocking back some of the hard edges that the gold has created, reintroducing some planes, simplifying that gold plain color, and blending in some of the darks from the background towards the front by adding ivory black and also raw umber and blending it with the golden that's still wet and pliable. This YouTube experience is quite a new thing for me. I'm learning quite a lot, I have to admit. Just this whole process of painting with the camera over my shoulders, editing. I just want to say that I have a tendency to sort of ramble on or skip over things or fast forward things. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below, and I'll be sure to get to them when I have a chance. You can see we've taken the camera off again, the tripod, and I am showing you the final marks that I think are quite interesting of the final result. You can see some brushwork, the way the golden glistens, difficult really to show with the camera or the photo, but it glistens differently. This painting, of course, is a recently painted portrait. I haven't had a chance to varnish it, which I hope I will in the coming months. But this really, close-up really showcases the brush marks that we covered in this impasto painting demonstration. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. Hopefully you picked up a trick or two. I'll see you in the next week's video.